Welcome back to Alive and Well Community's Daily Dose, your daily dose of support. Now, today we're going to be talking about a little bit of a heavier conversation as we think about how to prepare for difficult conversations around our own mortality. Now, for those of you who may not be in a place or space to engage in this conversation, we want to encourage you to put this episode on pause. Tune into one of our previous episodes or find another episode for self care out there to really be able to give yourself that daily dose of support. And then, whenever you're ready, whenever that may be, come back to this episode. But we want to make sure that you're empowered to know what we're about to engage in as we start to have these difficult conversations. So, with us today, we're joined by two very, very delightful experts. I'm so glad they've made time to join us. We have Dr. Jessie Gold, and Dr. Jessie Gold is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Washington University, as well as a practitioner on Washington University's campus. In addition, we have Dr. Brian Carpenter, who's a clinical psychologist specializing in aging, with an emphasis on collaborative family communication and decision making. Now, I am so glad that both of you are here joining us. I know, Jessie, that during this time you've written on a lot of heavier conversations, as well as you've written on a lot of lighter conversations, even talking about how, as a mental health professional, the tips and tricks that you're using to take excellent care of yourself during this time, recognizing this is a difficult time for all of us. So I'm so excited that we're joined by our two special guests today. So thank you so very much for joining us for this important conversation.
You're welcome.
So I want to just start off with a question, and Brian, if I can, I'll ask this to you. We know that, especially when it comes to having conversations around death and dying, that these are difficult conversations for people to proactively engage in. And I was wondering what you've found in your work as you've been doing this for quite some time now.
Well, you're right. These are conversations that people don't tend to invite unless there's some sort of need or crisis that arises. But we've come to understand that it's really helpful for people to talk about their preferences and their values and what's important to them early as possible, before they're faced with any sort of crisis or emergency, because it allows them to have those conversations at their own pace with the people who are important to them, in a place and a time that allows them to explore what's important to them and how they feel about these issues. So even though there are difficult conversations for people to start and they're reluctant to have them, we encourage people to approach them as early as possible. Start out small. It's not like you need to decide everything on the very first conversation, and just help people feel more comfortable with approaching the topic.
Absolutely. Now, when we have these conversations proactively, even though it's a heavier conversation that many of us don't like to think about well in advance, can we have these conversations in a way that empowers us, in a way that may relieve some anxiety or even help us to feel more in control about our own destiny?
I think that's definitely why we encourage people to have early conversations, is that it does give them the control to start the conversation and then let people know about what's important to them. People are afraid that when they get toward the end of their life, that they will lose independence, lose control, lose autonomy, that people will be making decisions for them. And so by talking about what's important to you early, you make sure that people know what's important to you and how you want to be taken care of, where you want to be taken care of, what you would want in terms of care and what you wouldn't want in terms of care. And being able to express your opinions and your wishes ahead of time means that it's more likely that those wishes will be followed if there ever came a time when you couldn't talk for yourself.
Absolutely. Now, Jesse, I know that you found that many people don't have these conversations proactively. That in fact it's very few that do make these arrangements. Now, can you talk from your perspective about why it's so important to proactively have these conversations in a way where we feel empowered, like we have control, and as Brian mentioned, that our wishes can be honored?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The data does suggest that most people don't have these conversations, or they've had them, but they didn't record them. What ends up happening in those circumstances is the decisions then fall to the family to make those decisions. And you probably can think of cases in the news where that doesn't necessarily go that well because somebody in the family remembers one conversation and somebody else in the family remembers something else. And it's really important that if you have opinions, that your wishes are carried out, because there are lots of things that can happen in medicine that are maybe not ways that you would like your life to be lived. So there are quality of life indicators that people think about when thinking about what kind of treatment they would want, or treatment prolonging measures. Would you want to be intubated, like have a tube put in your throat to help with breathing? There are things like that that people just really need to think about, because even though it's kind of like scary a little bit to think about, it allows you to kind of think about what kind of life you would be okay living, first of all. Right now, I think everything feels out of control. And one of the reasons everybody is so anxious is that everything feels out of control. And it's nice to have something to feel in control over. And if this is something you can have control over, having these conversations right now seems like a good time. I know it sounds morbid a bit because like there is a lot of death and dying right now, but I think that's just as good a time as any to have this conversation, if not the best time to have this conversation. It's important that your family members know what your wishes would be.
So then let me ask you two, who should be engaging in this conversation? Are we thinking only individuals who may feel like they might be close to that stage, or who should be engaging in that conversation?
I think we'd probably say everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends, doctors often don't think a lot about our mortality. It's traditionally not something we think about, but right now, especially with the way that coronavirus has been and the high mortality rates in healthcare professionals, doctors have been thinking a lot more about it. Trainees have been thinking a lot more about it. I have a lot of friends who have been doing this when they haven't had done it before because they're young and healthy and thought, well, like I'm fine, I'll do it later. But it's really important to have it done and have these conversations no matter who you are, because you never know. Like these things are not things you can predict, and it's important to have thought them out.
Jesse, I think Jesse's right. I've been telling people for years that no matter how old they are or what their circumstances are, they should be having these conversations. And I also think that Jesse makes a good point that this is maybe a moment in time when, if you were before unsure about how to start these conversations and have them, this gives you the pandemic, unfortunately, gives you the perfect reason and excuse to bring it up with your family members, because it's in the news. People are understanding what's going on. And so if people had been unsure about how to start the conversation before, now they have the perfect opportunity.
So then with that very question in mind, how is it that we might start this conversation with our family, regardless of our age, as we think about, as we think about how we would want to live, or what measures we would like to see taken in order for life-giving measures? How is it that we may start this conversation with a loved one or a family member, especially during, as you two mentioned, a time of such high stress where we're unfortunately we're seeing a death count across our country?
I usually tell people or give people the advice that they might approach this one of two ways. Option A would be to put it on yourself and say, I've been thinking about my future and with everything going on in the world, I want you to know what's important to me. And so would you mind if we have a conversation about, how I want to be taken care of? That's option A. Option B is similar, but it's just kind of flipped and directed towards the other person. I've been watching the news and I realize I don't really know much about what's important to you. And that would be really worthwhile for me to know. So would it be okay if we had a conversation about how you want to be taken care of so that I know that I'm aware of your preferences and can make sure that if you can't talk for yourself, I can make sure you get what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we function more in taboo, like hard to talk about subjects than we think we do. I think we tiptoe around them so much that it makes them harder. Like, I'm a mental health professional. I talk about death in different ways. Like, I talk about people who take their own lives a lot, and we don't tiptoe around that conversation as much as like most people do. And people, when they're on our rotations and they're having conversations with us, that's one of the harder things is like, how do I talk about suicide or how do I ask someone about those thoughts? But those thoughts are super normal. So for me, the concept of like asking those questions is super normal. So it's like you get used to it. The same way that Brian's super used to having these conversations. I know it sounds like kind of hard to believe that I'm super used to talking about the other kind, but I think it's like we tiptoe around these topics so much that it makes them harder to talk about. If we would just start talking about them, they wouldn't be so hard to talk about. It's like we hide the snake behind the door and the snake becomes a really, really big monster snake instead of just that tiny little garden snake. You know what I mean? Just makes them way worse.
And I think people are surprised that although they think that other people aren't thinking about these things and don't want to talk about these things, when you bring it up, you might be surprised to find out, oh, well, yeah, they are more willing to talk about it than I thought they would be.
So sometimes how we build it up in our head might be much larger than it actually is when we start to engage in the conversation. So part of just starting is actually just starting the conversation. Okay. Now, I think about for caregivers, whether you're a parent or aunt or uncle, and you're caring for a family member, whether it's an older family member or a younger family member, in having this conversation, we can also have great peace knowing that the rest of our family is taken care of, that we know how to best ensure their well-being even after we've passed. I want to ask what sorts of things should be integrated in this conversation in terms of one's wishes. Because I think for me, if I were to have this conversation today, I wouldn't even know fully what we should be talking about.
Let me throw some jargon at you, so people are familiar with some of the words that we use when we're talking about these things. So for me, this process is one that people sometimes refer to as advanced care planning, which sounds fancy, but it just means planning for the future, your future. And advanced care planning in the medical world typically consists of a couple of things. First, it means filling out and talking about your medical preferences for how you want to be taken care of if you became seriously ill. And that might involve filling out a living will, where you would talk about what kind of medical interventions you would want, what kind of medical interventions you wouldn't want in different situations. So that's number one. That's the first step in advanced care planning. And the second jargon I'll throw at you is that in addition to filling out a living will, maybe even more important is that you can decide who you would want to make decisions for you if you couldn't make them for yourself. And that's designating another person to be your surrogate or your proxy, or what in the legal world they call your power of attorney, your durable power of attorney. So this process of advanced care planning means expressing your medical preferences and designating your surrogate. And having that conversation is one where you're talking about what's important to you, what quality of life means to you, if there would be circumstances that would be worse than death in your mind, giving your family members and your friends and your surrogate an idea about what you would want and what you wouldn't want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Jesse, I know that you've written an article even talking to this effect during this time. That sometimes when we don't have a power of attorney in place, or practices aren't known, we know that sometimes, as you mentioned, it's left up to the family, or sometimes hospitals have to make these decisions on their own. And that can sometimes feel more disempowering than anything else.
Disempowering for everyone. I think it depends on, there's all sorts of rules in hospitals about how these things go. There's usually an ethics board and rules about who gets to make these choices and who gets to decide. But it's really hard for the clinician when there's no decision making ahead of time, because they are kind of managing everybody's anxiety and trauma around it, which is like the family thinks they know one thing and remembers one thing, or different family members remember different things. And then there's the hospital and the ethics that are involved with that. So it's just a lot of different stress. And I think you'll notice that it's just a much harder process for everyone if there is nothing in place ahead of time.
It almost sounds like in that scenario, when we don't have some of these conversations in advance, that kind of no one wins. The system is put in a difficult position, the family's put in a difficult position, and then you have the individual whose wishes aren't being honored fully to the extent of how they see their own life and what they want and need. That piece isn't even taken into consideration. So we talked about the power of attorney, and we talked about those medical aspects. Are there other things we need to have conversations about when we're thinking about our own care and our own future?
I can think of a couple topics that are related but separate, and they're not part of the usual advanced care planning process that's more medically focused.
Mm-hmm.
But you can actually designate a surrogate to make medical decisions for you, and another surrogate to make financial decisions for you. So there's a medical power of attorney and a financial power of attorney. They might be the same people for you, but they might be different people. Maybe somebody in your family has some medical expertise and you'd want them to be your medical power of attorney. And somebody else might have a different kind of expertise and they might be your financial power of attorney. So finances is another topic that we encourage people to talk about. Housing, where do you want to live? Where do you want to be if you get seriously ill?
Mm-hmm.
And we also want people to be talking about their post-death preferences. What do you want to have happen to your body? Do you know where you want to be buried? Do you want to be buried? People have, sometimes very important preferences to them about what kind of ceremony they want to have.
Yeah.
Now, setting aside the fact that ceremonies look a lot different in the context of COVID than they used to. But it's useful for people to talk about what they would want in terms of a commemoration or a memorial.
Absolutely. Now, I want to ask, as we think about, including our family in this conversation and sharing our wishes, what sorts of ways can we bring up this discussion with our families, thinking if we have smaller children, or if there might be people who may not agree with our wishes that we've set forth?
I think this is one of those landmines that people are worried about, that that this will be a conversation that creates tension and conflict and argument, which is the last thing that people want these days. I'm going to mention a resource that I think is really, really helpful. It's a nonprofit that's put together a conversation guide. And in the conversation guide, they give you lots of tips about how do you start the conversation, what should you be talking about? What should you cover? It gives people some things to think about before they bring up the idea of a conversation. And it leads people to lots of resources to help them fill out these documents and have the conversation. It's put together by an organization called The Conversation Project. They have a fantastic website that you can find at conversationproject.org. And they have a starter kit that kind of leads you step by step through the things that you need to think about and the things that you need to talk about. So I think using resources like that can be a great way to help people figure out, how do I go about this with my family, and what would I do if I ran into some of those landmines, like somebody who had a really different opinion than I did? How do you diffuse that situation or deal with it?
Yeah. I mean, I think we also think our kids don't understand or want to talk about this, but they're much older than we think they are. Like, I often think about things like Mr. Rogers when I think about that. Like, Mr. Rogers was really good about knowing that kids were observant and always were taking things in and always did a really good job, like, whatever was going on in the world, incorporating it into the show in a way that was like actually speaking to the kids, knowing that the kids were paying attention and saw all of the things going on and wanted someone to explain it to them just in the same way and spoke their language, you know? And I think that kids are not just sitting at home going, why are we at home? This seems fun. You know, all of their classes were canceled. They hear things on the news. Their parents might be stressed out. Their parents might be losing their jobs. Someone in their family might have died. They're very aware. They hear things. You know, I think we take for granted that we're like whispering and our kids don't hear, but they hear. So I think like having these conversations and giving your kids like space to have them is really important, because it like treats them like people. It gives them space to have feelings and like express what they're feeling and ask questions. And I think that it is like not just like negating them as not a member of the group, right? Like, you can't, just because you're 6 or 7 doesn't mean you don't get a voice. I think it's helpful to let them feel like that maybe you're not going to completely take everything they say into account and exactly what you want, because you might already have what you want. But I think it's important to give them some empowerment, because you're their parent or their sister or their caregiver or something. I think you just, those are the things I think about when I think about children and psychology and psychiatry.
So it's important to include everyone in this conversation. So not just adults, but recognizing that kids, as we've said over and over throughout this time, are very intuitive. And while they might not intellectually understand the realities, that intuitively they know something is different and something is going on. So having those conversations, even with children, is important. Wonderful. Now, I have to say, for me, sometimes when I know that there's an end to this process and that the end is going to feel better, I'm going to have less anxiety about the future, I'm going to feel more in control, that might help jumpstart me into having a conversation. I'm wondering, in your experience, what have you found that when family proactively engage in this conversation, how is it that they're feeling afterwards?
I think the most common reaction I've heard from people is surprise. That number one, the conversation was easier than they thought it was going to be, and number two, that they learned things that they didn't know before. Sometimes people will say that they thought that they knew what their parent wanted, or they thought they knew what was important to their spouse or partner. And then when they got into the conversation, they were like, wow, I didn't know you felt that way, or I didn't realize that was what was important to you. And so the surprise, I think, is an unexpected reaction that people have. And it also helps them walk away from those conversations feeling like they really learned something important and genuine that they hadn't known about before.
And Jesse, what has your experience been in this when people, when families, when individuals engage in these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of what we're talking about, this like enormous buildup, but there is a sense of relief afterwards. And I think that there's a lot of like, oh, that was a lot of buildup that I shouldn't have. And we have that about a lot of things. We give ourselves a lot of anxiety over too much sometimes, but that's why I exist as a professional. But I think that when we do that, the conversation is often relieving, but it takes a long time to have it. And I do think I agree with Brian. There's a lot of like, that was really interesting. I didn't know you felt that way. Or I learned this about my like partner that I've been with for a very long time, because there might not have been a topic you ever talked about before, because it is sort of a topic you don't just talk about, you know? So I think it is eye-opening in some ways. It's relieving in some ways. There might be additional conversations that come from it that are helpful for a relationship in some ways, or a family in some ways. You know, I think these conversations can always lead to additional things to work on or think about, or, you know, repair or build strength and strengthen in your relationship. You know, you were talking about, what if you like hit a roadblock and you have to argue your way out of it or whatever. I mean, it helps you build communication skills and figure out where those conflicts are in your relationship, so that if this is the topic that brings it up, it was probably going to come up eventually. So it seems like that's as good a time as any to work on that too, you know?
Absolutely. So we're coming close to the end of our time, and I just want to ask, is there anything else that we should be aware of as we have these conversations in an effort to feel empowered and control, to lessen that anxiety that may come when in a state of crisis or when preparing? Is there anything else that our viewers should be aware of?
Well, one thing I could suggest is that, as you've alluded to, you know, starting this conversation, having these conversations is an act of control. You know, you are taking control of part of the situation, at least, and doing something proactive for you and the people that you care about. So people should feel good about the fact that this is something they can initiate, and it is taking control in a situation that may seem otherwise really out of control. The other piece of advice I might give, based on feedback I've heard from other families, is that it's good to think about these conversations as not something that you just have once, and that it has to be hours long and torturous, and you have to cover every detail and possibility. That it's okay to start out small and come back to the conversation later. And in fact, people's attitudes and opinions and preferences change over time. And so these aren't events that have conversations that happen once and then you're done with it. These are the conversations that can unfold gradually over time as people become more comfortable talking and thinking about these things, and more clear in their own minds about what's important to them. So take it slow. You don't need to do it all at once.
Fantastic advice there. Jesse, other things that we might want to consider?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that, like all things, like let yourself have the feelings that you're feeling. I think that we're not very good at that in general. This is a time of roller coaster feelings. So any feelings that you're having right now, all the time when you're having feelings that are valid, but especially right now, they're valid. I think we're pretty good at saying stop feelings like I don't want to have them, and trying to push them down and keep doing our jobs and keep focusing and doing whatever we need to be doing. And that's okay. You know, you have to do your job, but do give yourself space to have them. Do forgive yourself for having them. Do give your family space for having them too. That all is really important in like having self-compassion about some of this stuff, and, you know, compassion for the other people in your life for feelings. I think all of these conversations can bring up additional feelings. So understanding that, especially having these conversations during a time of heightened emotion and heightened mortality, will have additional emotional context as sort of like just magnifying it. So keeping that in mind, just giving yourself space to feel. I will also point you to a different resource. My friend runs a nonprofit called Endwell. The website's endwellproject.org. They also have a good, like pretty active Facebook community, and they do a lot of like talks and things like that about end of life conversations, and have a bunch of really creative people that are thinking about this space. And if it's a space that's interesting to you, or you want to learn more, or you want support around it, that's also a place to go. If that's of interest to you. So I'll point you that way. She's the person who co-wrote the piece that you're talking about that I wrote. And so I figured I'd also give her a shout out for that as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure that both of those resources are listed, because I think having this conversation, especially as you mentioned, Jesse, during this heightened time of emotion, can feel even more overwhelming. And so having resources, whether it's the Endwell Project or whether it's the site you shared, Brian, that will share both of these resources so people feel empowered to have these conversations. I want to say a special thank you to you both for engaging in this conversation. As we think about the daily dose and providing a daily dose of support, we know that sometimes the uncertainty of the future can be a big weight on our shoulder, causing anxiety. And so, in an effort to alleviate some of that anticipatory anxiety, just having these conversations proactively becomes so crucial for taking care of our well-being. And we're so thankful that you two made time in your busy schedules to join us. And thank you for sharing such wonderful insights with us. I took a lot out of the conversation myself, so I greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for letting us talk about it.
Absolutely. So for our viewers who are tuning in live or after the fact, your daily challenge is going to be to think about what is it that you need and want, and thinking about who is it that you need to have those conversations with, and recognizing that sometimes we may build up those conversations in our head, and that part of having the conversation is just engaging in that very first step. So your daily challenge is going to be to start to think about what you need and who you need to have those conversations with. And as usual, please be sure to share this daily dose, because recognizing we could all use a daily dose of support during this time. So thank you so much to our guests. Thank you so much to our viewers. And to our viewers, please tune back in tomorrow for another episode of Yoga Sundays. Thank you so much.
Thanks.